A very warm welcome to you from the latest Minds and Money 5 at 5. My name is George Heppel from CRU, and today we're going to be discussing the rare earths markets with a panel of experts from across the industry in a variety of roles. We're joined by Ian Gandel from Australian Strategic Materials, Filip Kozlowski from Leading Edge Materials, Gaius King of Fox-Davies Capital, and Nabeel Mancheri from the Rare Earth Industry Association. We're going to be covering a wide range of topics across the rare earth sector, including looking at supply and demand and recent market dynamics, and also sort of policy and geopolitical drivers. And just to sort of kick us off, I have a question for Nabeel. So Nabeel, obviously, through your work through the REIA, I was just wondering if you could just give us a flavour of what the main sort of characteristics of the rare earths market are that kind of set them apart from more conventional mining industries like base and ferrous metals that our viewers might be a little bit more familiar with.
Thank you, George. I'm very happy to join this panel discussion, and this is the second panel discussion that and you rightly mentioned. Rare earths are pretty, in the news media these days, and for myself, I represent RIA, the only global association advocating the rare earth industry, which was born in Brussels in 2019, and we are counting with 40 members. Some of the panelists are also members of Rare Earth Industry Association. And you mentioned that, unlike base or ferrous metals, rare earths are 17 elements plus scantium and yttrium that are clubbed together in the periodic table. And though they are chemically related, each of them have very different industrial applications. And based on their atomic weight, they are also differentiated as light rare earth and heavy rare earths. And they are called industrial vitamins, as we need very tiny quantities of these materials in many applications, unlike base metals. For example, elements like lanthanum and cerium are used for petroleum refining, glass, and ceramic industry. However, by value, the most important elements are neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, as they are used in powerful magnets, with applications in a wide range of sectors such as wind turbines, electric and hybrid mobility, electronic industry, and so on. And price, for example, compared to base metals or ferrous or non-ferrous metals, prices also hugely vary each of these elements. For example, lanthanum and cerium, these days trade around $1 to $2 per kg. On the other hand, the heavy elements like terbium trade around $1,200 per kg. So there is a huge difference even among these elements for prices. And on geologically, there are also huge difference. For example, it's pretty easy to mine and process base metals like copper or iron ore, but for these elements, they are actually found in various ore bodies such as monazite, basanite, cenote, ionic clays, etc. And each deposit have unique characteristics and total rare earth content. And for example, monazite and basanite are the major ore type that are currently exploited these days, largely in China and in Australia these days, and also there are minor production in other countries, including in Africa. And for example, the ore type like ionic clays have rich content of the heavy rare earth. But on the other hand, bastanites or monazite usually have huge content of light rare earth like lanthanum, cerium, and neodymium. So I hope, yeah, thank you, George.
That's great, Nabeel. I love the sort of simile of saying they're like industrial vitamins. I think that's fantastic. Yeah, so that's some really good points about sort of rare earths being significantly harder to extract, having widely different prices and having a sort of basket of materials that cover a lot of different sort of metals and applications. Yeah, very interesting. Passing now to just a question for Ian now. Ian, what would you say are the main challenges and pitfalls to look out for when evaluating a rare earths project? I mean, you've been in the rare earths sort of exploration and junior mining industry for a few years now, and what would you say are the main things to sort of look out for when you're looking at rare earth projects in general? And Nabeel mentioned the complexity of the ore bodies, but what other factors are there to consider as well?
Excellent. Look, very good question. Thanks, George, and welcome everybody on the panel. Thanks for joining. Look, there are a number of pitfalls that one needs to look out for. I go back to my time, and I've been in the industry now for 20 years, but it goes back to the time in 2011 when there was the rare earth boom that came about. And what people talked about and the explorers talked about is the size of the deposit. Mine's bigger than yours. That doesn't mean it's going to be profitable. Then people started talking about the value of my basket of rare earths. This is what my rare earths are worth. And frankly, that doesn't give you anything in relation to profitability. Then it was, well, what's the percentage of heavy rare earths to light rare earths? Because in general, the heavy rare earths are more valuable. But again, if you haven't got a feasible way of extracting them, you may have something that is valuable, but it's going to stay in the ground. Then if you hear somebody saying, oh, rare earth processing, we just use a conventional process, exactly as Nabeel said, well, people are all different and ore bodies are different. So you need a flow sheet for each deposit. And this takes, if you do it fast track, it might take you 5 years. But I keep hearing people saying, I've got a deposit, we'll be in production next week or next year. You know, I'm still waiting to see the first person that can do that. Then they, and I can see other people smiling, so, you know, I know they've had experience with this. Then there's the classic of, if somebody says to you, developing a flow sheet is easy, start walking the other direction, because we have been at ours for 15 years and it takes time. It's iterative. You've got to go back again and again and again. Then you have people saying customers are going to be lining up. Well, not necessarily, because most rare earth producers are going to produce oxides, and what actually goes into a rare earth magnet is a metal. So the customers are going to be lining up. You have to look into that in a bit of greater depth. And then, of course, it's, well, once we produce the material, it'll be sold. Well, the answer again is, well, there are certain things called specifications. Go and see if you can talk to the US military about supplying something that's not that's a substandard specification. It doesn't work. So when it boiled down, there are 5 steps you've got to go through. The first one, you need to have a deposit. Plenty of people have deposits. You need to have a process to separate the rare earths and to deal with the radionuclides. That's very important, because there are a lot of countries that won't touch radionukes. The third one is you have to build a demonstration plant. So if you haven't got a demonstration plant, you can't produce quantity of material that you can give to prospective off-takers that they can actually pre-qualify your material. Then the fourth one is you've got to produce to a quality that your customer wants. And quite often that is metals, not oxides. So if you're talking to somebody and you're going to be producing a rare earth oxide, whether it's separated or concentrated, you may be talking to the wrong person, because the end user typically wants metals. And fifthly, you've got to have a customer that recognizes the scarcity value of the rare earths that you can produce and will pay the price required so that you can go and get the debt, it can support ECA financing, and you can raise the equity and still make a return. So if you said to me, what are the main challenges and pitfalls? What I'd be saying to you are probably, number one, look for people with credibility on the board and management that have been working in the industry and on a project for quite some time. Secondly, have a look at what they're going to be producing. Don't just accept what they say, because if they're going to sell a mixed concentrate, that'll be at a large discount and typically it'll go to China. Or are they going to sell separated rare earths, as Lynas does? And successfully, I've got to say, I've been to the plant in Malaysia, and let me tell you, it is a good operation. Or thirdly, do you turn around and try to produce a metal, as ASM will, so you can actually talk to that end customer? And finally, the litmus test for me is actually, have they taken the time to build a demonstration plant that is capable of taking the ore to the finished oxide or metal? Because that is probably the biggest hurdle that investors don't know about. So test that case. That's what's important. So I hope that gives you a decent answer, George.
Thanks, Ian. No, that's fantastic. I mean, it's yeah, it's really interesting to sort of shed some light on the processes associated with setting up one of these junior mining operations. And yeah, I think especially it's almost not the oldest trick in the book, but certainly a big trick is sort of like producing a concentrate, planning to produce a concentrate, but selling your operation as if you're going to be producing sort of ultra high purity rare earth metals and that kind of thing. So no, very interesting. Thank you very much. Going now to Gaius. Hi Gaius. I mean, we've spoken about sort of the complexity of the ore bodies. We've spoken about how the basket of rare earths comprises over 17 different elements. You've done a lot of research on kind of on sort of the supply demand of rare earths and that kind of thing. I was just wondering from your sort of perspective, which of the elements within the rare earth basket are the most sort of at risk, and which ones are likely to be most at risk over the next few decades, and why? Which ones are you most concerned about, would you say?
Yeah, look, thank you very much for the question, George. Can I just step back just for 10 seconds and just say congratulations to Ian and Australian Strategic Minerals. I wrote a note on the Dubbo Zirconia project back in 2005, and Ian Chalmers was driving the project back then, and it's taken 17, 18 years to get to a point where they look like they're going to produce metals. And just to reiterate, everything Ian said is absolutely true. These things are very difficult. They take a long time, processing plant, getting the finance together. Demand and supply is critical, which I'll get to in a second. And you guys are basically the only ones outside of Lynas and I suppose Mountain Pass that are up there. Look, getting back to your question, I suppose there are two parts, and I'll ignore the different part of rare earths and the basket. But I guess, and this might be a bit controversial, and I've had some feedback from certain parties. We are at Fox-Davies really only interested in light rare earths, and Ian will probably throw something at me in a second. But metals are critical, and everything Ian said is absolutely correct. Only because we're focusing on the new green economy, inverted commas, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and permanent magnets. So we estimate roughly about 50% of high-tech energy applications require permanent magnets, and they go into actuators, sensors, electric motors. And these light rare earths have a very limited geographical impact. There are certain deposits that contain more than other deposits. And if you look at the market as a whole, China supplies of the processed rare earths about 80%, but more importantly of light rare earths, 88 to 90% is controlled by China. But it's because they control outside Linus and now Mountain Pass very soon supplying the domestic market. They supply very much the downstream processing as well. And we estimate the global production of these two is around about 20,000 tonne per annum. Now, everyone talks about cars. We do a lot on lithium and a lot on car growth, electric vehicles, which is about 3 million units this year. But every investment bank has been wrong on the growth of electric cars, and some by an order of magnitude. I'll repeat that, an order of magnitude. So, but we're very bullish on rare earths, and so we just thought, look, what's a good example? So we think actually after 2028, the biggest growth of light rare earth and permanent magnets are actually going to be in wind turbines. This is a quick shout out to Paul Atherley at Pensana fame. I asked him some numbers regarding some Korean turbines that are getting put out there. So he gave me a number for General Electric's 13 megawatt halide 10 model, and they use about 7 tonne of neodymium, praseodymium, iron boron. I'm not sure the exact alloy, but of that composition. The magnets is roughly around 25%. So therefore, your utilization is around about 1.7 tonne of magnets per megawatt, of which 145 kilos is neodymium praseodymium per megawatt, or 200 kilos if you convert it into an oxide. And we suspect that the Korean turbines, this new Korean project that we're looking at, are using roughly the same compositions. Now, so then we had a look at global wind capacity just last year, and 93 gigawatts was added in 2020 despite all the problems around the world, a large portion of that China. So if we calculate that out as a global demand just for wind turbines last year, it equates to around about 13,500 tonne of neodymium praseodymium metal, or about 18,000 tonne, 18,600 tonne, I think, from memory, of neodymium praseodymium oxide just for last year for wind turbines. Now, there are obviously issues with using that as an example, but the key thing that people don't look at is that these new generation of rare earth turbines, they're a lot more cost efficient, reliable, that require a lot less maintenance, and therefore they're also going to be larger, the utilization rates are climbing, and they're going to be far more economic in a decade than they are now. So we're using roughly 18% of all the neodymium praseodymium just in turbines last year. This next by 2028, the old generation of wind turbines that are existing now will be replaced by the newer generation, larger things. So we think demand will triple by 2028. And just to underline the point, we don't have supplies to meet that current demand.
Thanks so much, Guy. Just want to check that number. Did you say it was 1.7 tons of NdFeB magnet per megawatt? That's a huge number.
Per megawatt capacity.
Capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. So of that particular, yes. So 7 tonne goes into a 13 megawatt. This is just using the GE halide 10 model, and then you back calculate out the metal contents from that.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense.
Apologize.
Those are huge numbers.
Write it down in a report, then everyone goes, "Oh, okay." Yeah.
Those are huge numbers, and I actually I'm inclined to agree what you were saying, that sort of after 2028, sort of wind turbines become sort of the biggest growth factor, and we've seen the same thing. So CRU's done a lot of modelling of sort of long-term rare earth demands, like out to 2040, and you see sort of like a big peak for, not a peak, but you see like a sort of big sort of deluge of demand from rare earth, from electric vehicles for the first like decade, and after that, you know, the largest sort of proportion of demand growth actually starts to come from wind turbines. Definitely, you know, strong agreement with you there. Thank you very much. Now passing to Filip. So we've talked a lot about sort of a few different facets of the rare earth sector. One thing we haven't touched on too much yet has been sort of sustainability as a theme in the rare earths, obviously in the rare earth sector. So obviously ESG is a very important sort of theme across commodities at the moment. But how important is sustainability as a theme in rare earths at the moment, and how's that likely to change in the future? Do you think that's going to change in the future as well?
Thanks, George. Yeah, great question. And really, I would like to add sustainability as a sixth point to Ian's list of critical factors to look at. And for us as a company, we're looking at that 1 point in the near term, because that's the most important one for us. And taking a step back and looking more from above, why is sustainability important? And we've talked about electric vehicles, we talked about the wind turbines, and why this panel and everyone else and why media are so excited about these elements and these materials and these magnets is they are the materials that drive the clean energy transition. They're essential to that. And you can't really then so close your eyes towards the sustainability of those materials. You're replacing a non-sustainable fossil fuel system to a non-sustainable rare earth element system. It doesn't work. So and besides that as well, where everyone is looking to find more sustainable alternatives to the current supply of rare earth elements, which is dominated by China, and there are question marks how sustainably those elements are extracted, and we import that sustainability debt over to the Western world. And so that's my general comments on sustainability, but where sustainability is very closely interlinked to the social license to operate for a project. And that is very relevant for us, where the companies failed. Actually, we had the social license for a project with the mining concession, but then we lost that, and there's been very vocal public opposition against that. And it's a bit, I'm a bit biased, but I think it's a bit unfair, because where most of the opposition comes from is rare earth element extraction is always non-sustainable. So they put our project in that same basket. For example, highlighting rare earth element extraction always involves radionuclides and radioactive waste, whereas Norra Kärr as a project is probably one of the lowest radionuclide bearing projects globally. So it's from that angle, it's much more about raising the awareness as a first step why these elements are needed for a clean energy transition, but then also an acceptance for that and an understanding that the future holds a more sustainable way to extract these, and that by default extracting these elements in Sweden under Swedish environmental laws, just seeing the challenge it has been to get the permits here, it will be a more sustainable extraction. And if you don't have a social license for a project, you're never going to get investment, you're never going to build a demonstration plant, you're never going to be able to start qualifying material with your customers. So that's why I'm sort of moving that factor first, and the one we're imminently focusing on. But then, maybe one area of sustainability that is going to have an increased interest is the economic factors of it as well. So the common perception is no one will be able to compete with China on a cost basis to produce oxides, metals, or magnets. And I'm not the LCA expert, and someone should do more detailed calculations. But when I look at the greenhouse gas ton carbon footprint equivalent per ton of rare earth oxide or metal or magnet, and you use those numbers and apply where current carbon rights schemes are trading, but even more interesting when you start looking forward, say to 2030, where various nations such as the European Union, Canada, when they start talking about implementing carbon border tax schemes. And when you do that multiplication, you start seeing that is going to be a significant cost burden unless you have a lower environmental footprint. And for example, us being located in Sweden, we have access to hydropower, and some of the steps in the value chain of rare earths are very energy intensive. Extraction not so much, but processing, separation, and then metal production, where Ian's they developed a process that is much more efficient, and that's going to be a key factor. So I think once people start realizing the economic importance of sustainability, quite cynically, that's when people will start caring a lot.
Thanks, Filip. Yeah, no, it's such an important consideration across the industry, and it's you make a really good point about sort of the potential for sort of carbon border tariffs and how that might sort of disrupt things a little bit, depending on I'd say that's probably one of the biggest sort of policy challenges that we have to face over the next few decades, is how do you put a price on carbon? And that's not just in the mining industry, that's sort of just generally, and how do you do that in a sort of globally sort of holistic way? So I think just some general questions for the panel now. I've got a question here for Gaius and Nabeel, but Filip and Ian, please feel free to chip in as well. But, we've talked about sort of the risks associated with rare earth supply, over the next few decades. If the worst case scenario happens and we do have a shortage of rare earths, what impact would that have on the world's transition to sort of a greener economy? Would that slow down the transition? Would we see substitution effects? What sort of impact would a shortage of rare earths have on that sort of transition to e-mobility and renewable energy?
Thank you again, George. Yes, a very good question. The shortage of these materials, if you look at the even very recent report, like the agencies like IEA, the International Energy Agency, they predict that you need rare earth and other critical materials in huge amount to meet the green economy targets or carbon neutrality target that many countries are assigned to, and within the current development that we have, the exploration projects all over the world, including very advanced like ASM or leading edge or others in Australia or others. I think we don't see that a sudden stroke of supply restriction or it may be a gradual, but I think the projects that are coming up would be able to satisfy in a longer term the demand that are predicted in 5 or 10 years. And several companies and governments also have nationally assigned policies to meet that demand. So and moreover, rare earths are not, they are not rare at all. If you have enough capability, if you have finance is the main constraint here. And so if you have enough finance, you could easily have a project up running in 10 years. So and Ian maybe correct me, how he see in 10 years the supply is coming and could meet the demand that coming from e-mobility and wind energy industry. Thank you.
I'm actually far more bearish than Nabeel, unfortunately. I think just my experience of projects getting online in time, and I'd put the Dover Zirconia project up there, it takes decades. Secondly, when people can say that rare earths aren't rare and that they're equivalent to cobalt and whatever, I'm not putting economics around them. Rare earths are incredibly rare in economic concentrations, so I'll just differentiate with that. I would also say just the wind turbine demand alone, even ignoring the increases, and there was a massive increase in capacity last year, but even ignoring those increases and just replacing the older generation, which are coming to the end of their useful lives, there's not enough rare earths for that. So people seriously underestimate the demand for rare earths. And I can tell you now that the whole green energy transformation is not good. Copper is not the bottleneck. It doesn't matter what battery drives the electric motor. It's all about the electric motor. Now, human ingenuity as it is will find a way. Now, China can play games for a decade or so, but if you look at some of the research coming out of Japan in the last couple of years, they're doing some great stuff with samarium iron cobalt, brand new films, mimicking the old samarium magnets were actually quite expensive, and the new neodymium praseodymium magnets will replace those and made their expansion a lot cheaper. But the thing about samarium magnets is they operate at higher temperatures. The biggest shortcoming of the current generation permanent magnets is that I think once you get to about, I can't remember the exact temperature, and I should know this, I think it's about 120 degrees, but definitely by 180, the permanent magnets are gone. So you have to reprocess them. Samarium magnets, you can go for a fair bit higher. So a lot of our current technologies are limited by the temperature gradient at which these permanent magnets. So the Japanese, and we all know what happened to Japan a decade ago, where China said, right, punishment for a couple of fishermen, which I think was generated anyway. We're cutting off all your supply. There are developments in the wings, but they're going to take decades. And in the meantime, we have no real supply coming online. We have all this demand coming online. And the other key thing that I think, I don't want to take up too much time, but the key thing we have to understand is that Chinese supply is very much controlled by the state. So they're not out there mining and then supplying whatever they mine. They have enormous stores and they can release or contract. So late last year when I was looking at supply, they just cut supply by 25%. Which was identical to the cut in electric cars globally. So the Chinese are actively managing the supply of these rare earths into the market as they come. But there is a point, and I don't think anyone really knows, where they're going to keep it to themselves. They're not necessarily going to cut it for everyone else. They're just going to keep it for their own supply. And there's a number of projects out there, but there is no real alternative supply. Linus can't do it, Mountain Pass can't do it, and yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit more bearish, Nabeel.
And I'm also bearish. Yeah. I'm also bearish for another reason, Gaius, and that is that the Chinese will need their own rare earths for their own consumption, and I think a lot of people overlook that. So in terms of wind turbines and the neodymium, praseodymium that's needed, with you 100%, the demand is going to be enormous. And there'll be competition, which hopefully drives prices up between electric cars and wind turbines, but as we know, they're both needed. But the Chinese are very smart. They're very, very good. I'm not sure who's actually been to China and actually been to Beitao and actually seen their rare earth university, etc. But I've got to tell you, they have 1,000 PhDs. These people are smart, focused, and they're brilliant. But they will need the rare earths for their own internal consumption, and that is going to put the squeeze outside of China. So it's going to come from a different direction, in my opinion. It'll be for your reasons, for our demand, but also it'll be competing with China's own internal demand. Hence, the need to get more rare earth operations up. And I'm really pleased. The only issue is, again, you've got to take the next step, which is lean, green, and mean, but green. And that's also important. So go to metals.
Add to Jens' comment there, because I think you raised something very interesting, which is the innovation of it and about our research institute. And I think if I could just, one factor I would add, which is the biggest risk that I see it, is the loss of opportunity, because we're talking about electric vehicles, motors, wind turbines. That is existing technology, but there's a fantastic characteristics of these elements, and the innovation you can generate, you can only do that if you have access to the materials. Looking at the opportunity of magnetic refrigeration, mean, I've seen usage for quantum computing of rare earth elements.
Yes.
And one specific example that I've seen out of China, some nanofilm using rare earth elements, which can increase put on windows, can increase the energy efficiency of buildings by 40%. And they come up with that because they have the materials.
Yep.
They don't want to sell the materials. They want to start producing the products that use those innovations and sell that to us. So that's a big loss of opportunities.
But that's the whole reason why Japan jumped in very early on. They recognized this a decade ago. They invested in Linus because they knew what the consequences were a decade ago of if China cut their supply of rare earths. Now, back then, they estimated that 25% of all their high-tech applications relied on rare earths. And now that's in excess of 50%. And so that's the whole reason. If you look at the rare earth or the permanent magnet research, it's only coming out of 2 countries. Maybe it's coming out of China, but I don't think China needs to because it has a lot of rare earths. It's coming out of the US and it's coming out of Japan. That's it, globally.
Gaius.
And so they're the ones really driving the alternatives, but they can't find them. So what they're doing is they're finding rare earths, other rare earths, to try and duplicate the ones that they really need now. Now, whether they'll be successful or not is an entirely different question, way outside my experience. But yeah, that's the interesting bit.
Gaius, you cannot exclude South Korea from that.
And I wouldn't.
You can't.
No. But look, South Korea are in the same boat, but South Korea have only realized in the last 4 or 5 years. Japan realized a long time ago with the fishing boat incident. And that's when they started throwing money around. That's when they started investing in Linus. So the rest of us are just playing catch up.
Very interesting points from all the panelists there. I guess we've talked a lot about sort of China's dominance of the rare earth sector right now and Baotao and that kind of thing. I guess we've touched on a couple of answers to this potentially, but I just wanted to sort of narrow down what really, in the opinion of the panelists, what really explains China's dominance of the rare earth sector right now. How did we get to a point where China, was responsible for over 90% of global supply and the vast majority of processing as well? Is it the size of their reserves? Is it historical investment? Is it that they have better extraction technology? Is it more IP? Is it a larger focus? I mean, what really sort of explains how we've gotten to the point that we're in now?
Well, it actually comes down to Standard Oil. If you remember, the reason why they broke up Standard Oil and created all those oil companies is that they created a monopoly, and they purposely produced oil and petrol at below cost for years and years. And that's exactly what China did over 10 years ago. And everyone calls them a kook. But there's a guy called James Dines who writes his newsletter. He recognized this over 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so they put Mountain Pass out of business, and they put every other operation out of business. And it all came down to China. If you go back 2 decades ago, China only made up about 40% of the global rare earths. But critically, China's also been very clever, and Ian's made a point there, and I suppose that's his end user customers there. They went downstream. So, but not only that, they're taking in all the supplies from Vietnam, Burma, and other countries, and then so they're using all the processed materials. Can I also just, I know this is a little off track. Everyone's talking about these new projects with quite high value baskets of neodymium and praseodymium. And they're the oxide portions of these carbonatites on the surface, but they're only short-term value things. So you mine these things for 5 or 10 years and they're gone. And so if you ignore that, what's underneath is a lower grade, and that's all the global resources. There's no other supply than the Chinese, what the Chinese have. So we would have found it by now. So that's the critical bit. All these high-grade deposits that everyone's promoting around the world, and I like them as well, don't worry, but they're only very temporary. They're only a decade or so, even Linus. So, yeah, sorry, I'll just throw that in.
I'd also like to throw something else in, and that is we're talking about rare earths, but this is also about critical materials, which includes other things such as hafnium, scandium, zirconium, titanium. So there's a whole raft of other materials which are also on the short list for Europe, Asia, and America. So it's not just rare earths we're focusing on, we're also focusing on some of the other materials as well. So there are shortages coming there also.
And I would add niobium to that list as well, which also gives another example of how I think much of China's dominance comes back to the long-term vision, which I guess is a benefit of having a planned economy. But seeing how niobium imports in Europe are 100% dependent on Brazil, and everyone says, "Oh, we need to disconnect from Brazil." But what's happened over the last 5 years is that China has been increasing their ownership in that Brazilian production of niobium, and you've seen that same happen with the cobalt in Congo and the lithium in South America, and lithium in Australia as well. So it's coming back to the point that China is going to need all of their rare earths for themselves, and they know that they're not going to have enough themselves, so they're looking to secure that abroad, exactly as Japan does.
That's right. And what they are looking to do, they are currently securing offtakes and agreements from projects outside of China, and they can turn the tap on when they need it. And the beauty of what the Chinese, and it is quite brilliant, is they only have to put up the first half of the plant, ship the concentrate to China where it can get separated. Now, it's absolutely brilliant because their separation technology is top class. They have been at this whilst the West has unfortunately been put to sleep because we've been buying the Chinese rare earths. But that's what they've been buying up the offtakes and the mines around the world. So, Gaius, the real problem is which companies are free of this, I'll call it Chinese export control, because of even all of MP Materials product goes to China for separation.
Look, and okay, excellent point. And I'd add a caveat to what I said earlier. Of that oxide material that's been enriched in situ, that will always go to China because they're the only ones with the technology and the plants existing to process that technology, to process those higher grade in situ superficial deposits. So just ignore that because that has to go to China. We're never going to have, and it's going to cost too much to develop that technology in-house. What we should concentrate on is the underneath, very much lower grade, these high grinding product, large carbonatites underneath, because that's what we can control. We can't control those oxide materials. We either push them aside. If you don't want to give them to the Chinese, we can't process them. So they're going to go to the Chinese, and maybe they'll pay for the plant later on. But the key point then, and I come back to Nabeel, what said, they're not economic. They're even with the prices climbing as they are, they're nowhere near economic. So we sort of need prices, let's say double, maybe treble, where they are now, to make those large deposits. And they're the only source of a lot of these permanent magnet things that we can get. But that's my feeling when I've run some of the numbers. But I could be very wrong.
But I think Linus is actually an example that it can be done with a carbonatite, because they have built their plant in Malaysia. They can, but it's certainly going to take time, and it gets back to the right flow sheet.
Yes, but their superficial deposit doesn't last that long, really. We're only talking about the high-grade superficial, and Linus is unique in the world. And if you look at any other deposit globally, a lot of those deposits, especially the carbonatites, we only concentrate on the carbonatites because the neodymium praseodymium basket thing. They all have high-grade portions on the surface, but they last somewhere between, some of them last 7, I think some of the others might last 15 years. But what happens after that? And we don't have the technology to process that. And the reality is we probably never will. So, yeah, I mean, so the big question then becomes, where does our source of rare earths come from? And they have to come from these large carbonatites, which are very much lower grade, bulk tonnages, and they have to be processed somewhere else, probably in Europe. And I think guys like Pinsana and there's a Peak out of Australia at Teesside, Northumbria somewhere, looking at these plants and processing that's probably the right route. You know, a couple of years ago I think, oh no, you know, that's just promotion. But actually, when you go through the logic behind it, actually it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, interesting points, guys. Yeah, I think yeah, when we sort of originally was talking about sort of why China kind of dominates this market, you know, I guess, you know, we've had a lot of sort of very good sort of points made. Yeah, I think the takeaway for me, I was really surprised to hear that China was only responsible for 40% of rare earths 20 years ago. It kind of feels like it sort of snuck up on the world.
Look, don't quote me on that. I've got a graph. Okay, but if you go back several decades,
yeah.
Mountain Pass and China were roughly about equal. You don't have to go too far back. And there was a deliberate strategic decision for China to produce rare earths to expand and put everyone out of business. It wasn't by mistake. They drove the price so low. And then as soon as Mountain Pass went bust, they wanted to buy it. And it was only a couple of members of US Congress that stopped it at the 11th hour from the whole thing going through. It was a crazy situation. The US government was sleepwalking. And even now, even if you look at all the countries around the world, I think I did a graph somewhere, the US is still the most dependent on rare earth imports of any major economy in the world. And if you look at if you look at Japan, South Korea, and the US, they're the big three centers taking rare earths, probably Taiwan, but it didn't come up in my numbers. They're all still massively dependent on China. I think the least is Japan at around about 50-something%. So even after a decade or so, Japan hasn't really diversified much. But the US is somewhere around about 80% dependent on Chinese rare earths. And they can close that at any time. So I don't think they will, because the reaction will be obviously very, very strong. But there's nothing stopping them saying, look, we need this for ourselves. That's the way I'll do it.
Makes sense. I think unfortunately we're coming up to the end of end of our sort of allotted slots here. I'd just like to say thank you very much to our panelists, Ian Gandel, Filip Kozlowski, Gaius King, and Nabeel Mancheri. Thank you all very much for your contributions on this very interesting topic, and yeah, I look forward to exploring it further at a later date. You've been listening to Minds and Money 5 at 5, and on the topic of rare earths, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.